Before Merlin became a wizard, before spells, staffs, and prophecy, before Camelot and kings, there was silence. Not peaceful silence, but the kind that follows collapse. When empires fall, they do not disappear quietly. They rot, they fracture, and the people left behind begin searching for meaning in the ruins. Britain in the 5th century was such a place. Rome had abandoned the island. The legions were gone. The roads cracked and vanished beneath weeds. Cities emptied. Law collapsed into memory. And in that vacuum, fear became currency. People did not ask who would rule next. They asked who could see what was coming. Because when tomorrow feels like a threat, the future becomes something to fear, and prophecy becomes power. Merlin was born into this fear, not as a wizard, not as a legend, but as an answer people desperately wanted to hear. The Britain that produced Merlin was not medieval fantasy. It was raw, violent, uncertain. By the early 400s, Roman authority had collapsed entirely. Local warlords replaced governors, villages fortified themselves, and survival became personal. Into this chaos came invaders, the Saxons, the Angles, the Jutes. They did not arrive as conquerors at first. They arrived as mercenaries, then settlers, then rulers. Entire cultures were erased slowly, not in fire, but in assimilation. And people noticed something terrifying. No one was in control anymore. Kings rose and fell in months. Battles were fought without warning. Famine followed victory. Victory followed betrayal. In a world like this, facts lose value. Certainty disappears, but voices that claim certainty rise quickly. This is where prophets appear, not because they are supernatural, but because people need them.
Ancient societies did not separate psychology from spirituality. A man who spoke to voices was not dismissed, he was listened to. A person who survived trauma and emerged changed was not avoided, they were revered. Madness was not an illness, it was interpreted as access. And Britain had no shortage of broken men. The old beliefs never left. Even as Christianity spread, pagan traditions remained strong. Sacred groves, speaking stones, forests believed to listen. Nature itself was considered alive, and those who lived within it, away from villages, were seen as closer to truth. This matters, because the man who would become Merlin did not live in courts, he lived in exile. Long before Merlin, there was Myrdeen. Not a wizard, not a magician, a poet. A man remembered in early Welsh texts as Myrdeen Wilt, Merlin the Wild. He lived in the 6th century, a time when battles were small, brutal, and personal, and one battle broke him completely. The Battle of Arfderydd. Accounts tell us that Myrdeen fought or witnessed the Battle of Arfderydd. We do not know exactly what he saw, but we know what happened after. He fled, not tactically, not strategically. He ran into the forest, and he never came back the same. Texts describe Merlin speaking to animals. hearing voices carried on the wind, predicting deaths before they occurred. He screamed warnings, he sang poems no one fully understood, and he refused to return to society. This was not mysticism. This was trauma. Modern psychology would call it severe post-traumatic stress, possibly combined with psychosis. But ancient Britain had no such words. They had only one explanation. He had been touched by something beyond human understanding. Why he was believed? Because Merlin was sometimes right. And when a broken man speaks truths accidentally, people begin listening carefully. They didn't see illness, they saw insight. Merlin was not a wizard, he was a survivor, and history does not treat survivors kindly. Ancient societies did not ask why a mind broke, they asked what it revealed. When Merlin fled into the wilderness, people did not forget him, they whispered about him. A man who survives horror does not return unchanged, and when change cannot be explained, it becomes sacred. Merlin's isolation was not accidental. Across Celtic culture, forests were thresholds, places between worlds. To live among trees was to exist closer to truth, but farther from safety. And Merlin lived there deliberately. The voice of the wild. Poems attributed to Merlin describe birds speaking to him, rivers answering questions, the wind carrying names of the dead. To us, this sounds like delusion. To them, it sounded like communion. Because in early Britain, the natural world was not background scenery, it was alive. And those who listened too closely were believed to hear things others could not. Why broken minds were trusted? There is an uncomfortable truth buried here. People trust the traumatized when the world itself feels traumatic. A man who has already lost everything fears nothing, and a man who fears nothing speaks freely. That freedom, uncontrolled, raw, was interpreted as honesty. Merlin was not filtered by politics, he was not bound by loyalty. He said what he saw, even when it frightened people. Modern understanding tells us something ancient peoples did not know. Trauma survivors become hyper-aware. They notice shifts. They sense danger early. They read patterns unconsciously. When Merlin predicted violence, he wasn't seeing the future. He was recognizing the present. But to those listening, the result was the same. He seemed to know what was coming. Stories do not remain neutral. They grow. And when repeated, they evolve. Merlin's poems were memorized, retold, adjusted. Details sharpened, explanations faded. Soon, no one remembered the battle. They remembered the prophecy. And prophecy needs a source. So the source became supernatural. From man to myth. Merlin stopped being a poet, he became a seer. Then something more dangerous, a symbol. Symbols are not allowed to remain human. They must be simplified, elevated, deformed, and eventually worshipped or feared. the birth of the wizard archetype. Before Merlin, there were no wizards as we know them. There were druids, shamans, wise men. But Merlin introduced something new, a solitary figure separated from society who possessed knowledge others feared. This was not magic, it was alienation mythologized.
Ancient cultures explained difference through divinity. If someone survived what should have killed them, they were chosen. If someone knew what others did not, they were gifted. If someone suffered deeply, they were marked. Magic was not spectacle, it was explanation. By the time Christianity spread across Britain, Merlin's story was already old and deeply inconvenient. Because Christianity demanded order. Prophecy could exist, but only when controlled. Merlin was not controlled. He was pagan, wild, untamed, and worst of all, he was believed. Rewriting the prophet. The church faced a dilemma. They could not erase Merlin. He was too deeply embedded. So they reframed him. If he could not be removed, he could be corrupted. His visions became dangerous, his isolation suspicious, and soon his insight needed an explanation acceptable to doctrine. So they invented one. The demonic bloodline. The idea emerged slowly. Merlin was no longer simply gifted. He was half demon, born of a mortal woman and a supernatural father. This allowed the church to keep him while warning people against him. He was now both prophet and threat. Wisdom, but poisoned. Knowledge, but dangerous. Fear as control. This is where Merlin begins to darken, not in personality, but in perception. He is no longer a broken man. He is something else, something unsafe. In the 12th century, one man changed everything. Geoffrey of Monmouth. He did not invent Merlin, but he finished him. The political agenda. Geoffrey lived in a Britain struggling with identity. Norman rulers needed legitimacy. They needed history, and history needed heroes. Geoffrey's solution was elegant. He took fragments, Welsh prophecy, Roman myth, Celtic trauma, and fused them into narrative. The moment Merlin was created, Geoffrey merged Merlin with another figure, Ambrosius Aurelianus, a Roman-British leader remembered vaguely in chronicles. One was prophetic, the other political. Together, they became Merlin, not a poet, not a madman, but a wizard advisor to kings. Why this version survived? Because it served power. Merlin now validated rulers. He predicted kings, blessed bloodlines, explained authority. He no longer challenged systems, he upheld them, and that made him immortal. Camelot was never a place, it was an idea, a fantasy of order in a world that had none, and Merlin was its architect. Arthur needed Merlin. Arthur alone was not enough. A warrior king without divine approval is just another warlord. Merlin provided legitimacy. He chose Arthur, guided him, validated him. Magic became political. Why Camelot had to fall? perfect worlds cannot last, and myths require tragedy. Camelot collapses because it must. Merlin fades because he represents knowledge that no longer fits. Order replaces prophecy. Stability replaces vision. And so the wizard disappears, not in fire, not in battle, but in silence.
The women who silenced the wizard. Merlin does not fall in battle. He is not executed. He is not betrayed by kings. He is undone quietly, by knowledge, by intimacy, by trust. And in every version of the legend, the same pattern appears. A woman listens. Morgan Le Fay, the shadow of Merlin. Morgan was not originally a villain. She was a healer, a scholar, a woman with knowledge equal to Merlin's. In early traditions, she is not evil, she is feared, because she represents something dangerous in medieval storytelling, a woman who knows as much as a man. And Merlin's greatest failure was believing control was permanent. Nimue, Vivian, the Lady of the Lake. Her name changes, her role does not. She is young where Merlin is old, curious where he is weary, patient where he is arrogant. Merlin teaches her everything, not realizing that knowledge cannot be unlearned. The trap. In some versions, she seals him in a cave, in others inside a tree, sometimes in crystal, sometimes in air itself. But the meaning is always the same. Merlin is contained, not killed, contained. Why he had to be imprisoned? A prophet cannot exist forever, because prophecy disrupts order. Once a system is established, those who predicted chaos must be silenced. Merlin knew too much, and worse, he had already taught others.
The symbolism of the prison. The prison is never random. A cave, a tree, a stone. These are not punishments, they are symbols. Burial without death. Merlin is buried alive in story, not as execution, but as preservation. Knowledge locked away, danger neutralized, wisdom fossilized. The tree. Trees represent memory, roots in the past, branches reaching forward. To imprison Merlin inside a tree is to trap him between time, unable to influence the future, unable to escape the past. The cave. Caves are wombs, places of rebirth. But Merlin is never reborn. He remains suspended, potential unrealized. Why he never escapes? Because societies do not free truth-tellers once they've served their purpose. They mythologize them, and myth is a beautiful prison. Once imprisoned, Merlin changes again. He becomes safe. Stories soften him, edges are rounded, danger fades. Medieval romance. Merlin becomes whimsical, cryptic, playful, a helper, not a threat. This is deliberate, because dangerous wisdom must be disguised as entertainment. The Victorian rewrite. In the Victorian era, Merlin becomes moral, clean, gentle. No madness, no trauma,
because the Victorians feared disorder more than ignorance. Modern Merlin. By the time film and television take him, Merlin is harmless, funny, eccentric, loyal. The prophet is gone, the survivor erased.
The pattern Merlin created. Merlin did not vanish. He multiplied. The old man with a staff. Every wizard that follows him carries the same shape, an old man, a guide, a warning. From Odin to Gandalf, from Dumbledore to modern fantasy, Merlin is always present, but never central. Because wisdom must guide heroes, never replace them. Why wizards are always lonely? Because Merlin was, and loneliness became part of the archetype. Knowledge isolates, understanding distances, seeing patterns removes innocence. The wrong question has always been asked. The question is not, did Merlin exist? The question is, why did people need him to? The historical answer. Yes, there was a man, possibly several, a poet, a survivor, a broken witness to violence. But no spells, no magic, only memory, misunderstood. The psychological truth. Merlin exists because humans fear chaos, and chaos produces witnesses. Those witnesses are rarely celebrated. They are feared, then rewritten. Merlin was not powerful because he could change the world. He was powerful because he understood it. And that understanding cost him everything. His sanity, his safety, his place among people. Why he still matters? Because every era produces Merlins. People who see collapse coming, who warn, who are ignored until it's too late. Legends do not begin as stories. They begin as people, and people who see too much are rarely allowed to remain human. Merlin was not a wizard. He was a man who survived violence and spoke about it. History could not handle that, so it turned him into magic. Every society fears one thing more than violence: understanding. Because violence can be answered with force, understanding cannot. Merlin was dangerous not because he cast spells, but because he removed illusions. He saw patterns where others saw randomness, cycles where others saw chaos. And people do not like being told their suffering is predictable. Why prophets are always isolated. Throughout history, those who see too clearly are pushed away, not because they are wrong, but because they are inconvenient. Merlin did not belong in halls of power, because power survives on belief, and belief collapses under truth. So he was placed outside society. Not exiled violently, but gently, respectfully, dangerously. The polite exile. Merlin is never dragged screaming into the forest. He walks there. This matters, because it reflects how societies truly remove unwanted voices. They do not silence them openly. They simply stop listening.
Merlin remembers too much. That is his real affliction. He remembers wars before they are glorified. He remembers screams after victories fade. And memory, when untreated, becomes torment. The burden of survival. Most men die in war. Some live. And those who live carry what the dead escaped. Merlin's madness was not confusion, it was overload. Why forgetting is necessary. Civilizations survive by forgetting. If everyone remembered everything, society would collapse under guilt. Merlin refused to forget, and that refusal made him incompatible with civilization. Merlin and the illusion of control. The wizard is always portrayed as calm, in control, but this is projection. People want to believe wisdom brings peace. It does not. It brings clarity, and clarity is rarely comforting. Teaching as a mistake. Merlin's greatest error was teaching others what he knew, because knowledge spreads faster than stability. And once others understand how fragile order is, panic follows. This is why every version of Merlin's story ends the same way. He must be stopped. Merlin's imprisonment by women is not misogyny, it is symbolism. Why wisdom is neutralized by intimacy. Merlin is not defeated by force, he is defeated by closeness, because closeness requires vulnerability, and vulnerability dissolves authority. The end of the teacher. Once the student no longer needs the teacher becomes obsolete. Merlin's tragedy is universal. Every mentor outlives their usefulness. After Merlin disappears, something changes. The world becomes quieter, not safer, just quieter. Why silence feels like peace. Silence is often mistaken for stability, but silence is simply the absence of warning. Merlin's absence does not prevent collapse, it merely delays awareness.
The cycles Merlin saw: rise, stability, decay, collapse. Merlin saw this pattern everywhere, in kingdoms, in kings, in belief systems. He was not predicting the future. He was recognizing repetition. Why people reject cycles? Because cycles imply inevitability, and humans prefer to believe suffering is temporary and unique. Merlin shattered that illusion. Why Merlin had to become fiction? Reality could not contain Merlin, because reality demands accountability. Myth does not. Myth as mercy. Turning Merlin into fiction was an act of mercy for everyone. It allowed people to admire him without confronting what he represented. Why wizards are safe. A wizard is harmless. A witness is not. So Merlin became a wizard. The modern world still needs Merlin. The world no longer believes in prophecy, but it still listens to warnings, quietly, selectively. Modern Merlins. They are analysts, historians, psychologists.
people who say, "This has happened before," and they are treated the same way, ignored, dismissed, and then blamed. The final imprisonment. Merlin is now permanently imprisoned, not in stone, not in trees, but in entertainment. Why stories are the final cage. Once wisdom becomes story, it loses urgency. It becomes optional. Merlin can now be enjoyed without consequence. What Merlin was really warning us about. Merlin was not warning about monsters. He was warning about repetition. History does not repeat. Humans do. And Merlin saw that clearly. Too clearly.
The thing that lived in the forest. There is a version of Merlin that history does not like to discuss. Not the wizard, not the advisor, not the myth, but the thing people avoided. When the forest became afraid. Villagers stopped entering certain woods, not because of wolves, not because of bandits, but because something watched from within. Not eyes, awareness. They said if you stayed too long, you felt remembered, as if the forest knew who you were, and worse, what you would become. Merlin was not alone. Texts hint at this quietly. Merlin did not speak to animals. He spoke with them, not metaphorically, intimately, as if something older than language answered back. The old belief that never died. Before gods had names, before religion gave shape to fear, there was a belief older than Britain itself, that forests remember, that places absorb trauma, that if enough blood is spilled in one location, something stays behind. Merlin lived where battles had soaked the ground, and something listened. The contagion of knowing. Madness is not random. It spreads through exposure. Merlin did not lose his mind. He opened it. And once opened, it did not close again. Why people went missing. Stories tell of travelers who sought him. They wanted prophecy, answers, reassurance. Some returned changed, quiet, detached. Some did not return at all, not killed, absorbed. The horror of being understood. The most terrifying experience is not being hunted. It is being fully known. Merlin did not guess futures. He recognized people, and when he spoke what he saw inside them, they fled. The voice beneath the voice. Merlin's prophecies began changing. Early ones were political. Later ones were personal, specific, uncomfortably intimate. He spoke of deaths no one had shared, of betrayals not yet considered, of children not yet born. This is where magic ends. Magic is spectacle. This was violation, knowledge that should not exist, and people began to suspect something was speaking through him. The decision to bury him. The imprisonment was not romantic. It was not tragic. It was necessary.
why killing him was not enough. You can kill a man, you cannot kill what he knows. They feared that if Merlin died freely, whatever whispered to him would move on. So they sealed him, alive, aware, contained. The tree was not a prison. It was a marker, a warning. Do not listen. Do not return. Do not dig.
The thing that stayed behind. Merlin did not scream in his prison. He listened, and something listened back. Why the legends say he still lives? Because whatever spoke to him never stopped, and stories insist he is not dead, only waiting. Modern encounters. Even now, there are places people avoid, forests with no birds, clearings where sound feels wrong, places where electronics fail, and locals say the same thing quietly. Don't stay there after dark. Why this still matters? Because trauma does not fade, it accumulates, and when enough accumulates in one place, it becomes aware. Merlin was not a wizard, he was an interface. The final truth. Merlin did not predict the future, he listened to the past, and the past is never silent. Why history turned him into fantasy? Because the alternative is unbearable, that someone could hear what places remember, that suffering leaves residue, that knowledge itself can infect. If Merlin returned, he would not wear robes, he would not carry a staff. He would not advise kings. He would sit quietly and speak only once, and whatever he said would ruin you.
What listens when you listen? There is something worse than being watched, being acknowledged. Merlin was not feared because he spoke. He was feared because something answered. The forest was not empty. Ancient maps mark certain regions as blank, not unexplored, avoided. No roads, no names, no settlements. Places where travelers felt pressure in their chest and left without knowing why. Merlin lived there, not because he chose it, but because it allowed him to hear without interruption. The first night. The stories say his madness began suddenly. They are wrong. It began slowly. On the first night after the battle, he lay beneath the trees and realized something terrifying. The forest was already awake. The memory that moves. Trauma does not vanish. It sinks into soil, into stone, into water. Where blood soaks the ground deeply enough, memory forms, and memory wants release. Why he could not leave. Merlin tried. He walked toward villages and felt pressure behind his eyes. Not pain, resistance, as if something did not want him to forget. So he returned, and it let him breathe again. the language before words. Merlin's later prophecies were not spoken, they were felt. People described standing near him and experiencing sudden childhood memories, the sensation of drowning, grief with no cause, fear without an object. This is not magic, this is exposure.
What he transmitted. Merlin was not communicating information. He was transmitting states of awareness, and awareness, once transferred, does not leave cleanly. The eyes that were never described. No text ever describes Merlin's eyes. Think about that. Beards are described, robes are described, staffs are described, but not the eyes, because witnesses could not agree. Some said they reflected forests, some said they reflected faces, some said they reflected nothing at all. The reason children were warned. Before fairy tales, there were warnings. Parents told children not to wander, not because of monsters, but because of listeners. Things that did not hunt, things that waited. Merlin became associated with these warnings, not as the threat, but as the proof.
Merlin taught one last thing before he was sealed. Not to Nimue, not to Morgan, but to the land itself. The transfer. The moment he was imprisoned, the forest changed. Birds left, growth slowed, sound flattened. As if something had been completed, as if a circuit had closed. The dreams that followed. For generations after, people reported the same dream, standing at the edge of trees, hearing their own name spoken in their own voice from nowhere. Those who stepped forward woke up different, not insane, aware. Why the church stopped recording it. At a certain point, references cease, not fade, cease, as if someone decided this could not continue, because the more it was written, the more it happened. The modern silence. Today, the story survives as fantasy, but the places remain, and people still report sudden emotional collapse in forests, panic attacks with no trigger, the feeling of being recognized. These are dismissed. They always are. The final horror. Almost whisper. Merlin was not a man who heard voices. He was a man who realized the world was already speaking. And once you notice that, you cannot unnotice it. The last warning. Do not romanticize understanding. Do not seek patterns too deeply. Do not listen too long when silence feels crowded. Because knowledge does not arrive alone. The modern wizards, echoes of Merlin. Merlin never vanished. He fragmented, the shape that refused to die. Look closely at every modern wizard, not their magic, their posture. They are never young, never central, never fully trusted. They stand at the edge of the story, watching, waiting,
advising but never ruling. This is not coincidence. This is inheritance. Gandalf, Dumbledore, and the safe wizard. Modern culture did something deliberate. It made Merlin safe. Gandalf is wise but gentle. Dumbledore is powerful but apologetic. They guide heroes instead of becoming them, because a wizard who acts directly is too close to Merlin's original danger. So modern wizards are restricted. Rules, counsels, limitations. They could act, but they rarely do.
Why modern wizards avoid prophecy. Notice what they don't do. They don't predict futures clearly. They don't speak unavoidable truths. They don't shatter illusions. They offer riddles instead. Because prophecy, done honestly, destroys stories, and stories are how we stay comfortable. The bearded old man is a warning. The long beard, the staff, the tired eyes, these are not signs of power. They are signs of survival. Merlin aged because he lived too long with awareness. So modern wizards look ancient even when they are immortal. Knowledge accelerates aging. Understanding exhausts. Why wizards live apart. They live in towers, forests, remote schools, never cities, never crowds. Because Merlin taught us something unconsciously. Those who see too much cannot live among those who don't. Magic as a metaphor for insight. Modern wizardry is not about spells. It's about knowing things others don't. Secret histories, hidden mechanisms, uncomfortable truths. Magic is simply permission to understand, and understanding is isolating. The price is always loneliness. Every modern wizard is alone, even surrounded by students, even loved. They remain separate, because Merlin's original lesson survived. Awareness distances. Why wizards are never the main character. This is the most important inheritance. Merlin was never the hero. He was the one who knew the story. And knowledge disqualifies you from innocence. So modern stories protect their audiences by keeping wizards secondary. Heroes can dream, wizards cannot. The story that finally lets you go. Every story ends the same way. Not with answers, but with distance. The farther we move from the truth, the easier it becomes to live with it. Merlin understood this. That is why he did not fight the silence. He stepped into it. He knew the world does not destroy those who see too much. It outlives them. It waits until their warnings soften into myth, until their pain becomes entertainment, until their memory is safe enough to forget. And then it continues exactly as before. The forest never needed Merlin. It simply needed someone to listen long enough to carry its memory forward. And now that memory has been passed to you. If something in this story unsettled you, that was not fear. It was recognition, a quiet part of you realizing that some knowledge is meant to be approached slowly and left before it follows you home. So we will leave it here, at the edge of the trees, before the silence begins to feel crowded. This channel exists for stories history tried to soften, for truths disguised as legend, and for warnings hidden inside myth. If you listen closely, you'll notice they all say the same thing. Not everything that is buried is meant to be uncovered. Thank you for staying until the end. And remember, the world does not speak loudly anymore. It whispers.